Day, everybody, and thanks for tuning in to the podcast, The Coldest Murder. My name is Mike Missinelli. Also on the screen, my partner is in this venture is Vince Mola. He is up joining us from New York City because Vince is a native of Bucks County, having grown up in Bensalem, PA, a town adjacent to Bristol, PA, the town where this terrible murder of 9-year-old Carol Ann Doherty took place. Now, this is podcast episode number 10. During these podcast episodes, we've attempted to explore the elements of this heinous crime with the hope of shedding enough light so the case finally, once and for all, comes to a closure. It's a case that has been open-ended for more than 60 years. Today, it is my privilege to welcome in the sister of Carol Ann Doherty, Kay Doherty Talanka, and somewhere in the background is her daughter, Jen Boyanemas. Ladies, I am so honored to be with you today because your story, the human element of this story, is what to me is the most important thing. So welcome, guys, and Kay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. You're welcome. I'm privileged. It's a privilege to be here.
Thanks, Ken.
Uh, Kay, there's so much we've spent so much time exploring the criminal element of this case, but I think it's very important for the our listeners and viewers to hear really how this has affected your family and the lives of your family, and it's been you've had to live with it for so many years, and having been back in Bristol and exploring this whole situation and talking to the people, so many people grieved over this, so many people were hurt by this. And as I explained to you in our conversation, it was like the town of Bristol had been draped in sad clouds for a really long time. And so all these years, I have to ask you a general question. How have you been able to process this?
Mike, when I was growing up, my parents, I knew I had a sister. I knew that she had been killed. I didn't really know any details. My parents, kept me sheltered from that. But I guess it was really with J.D. Mullane's series of articles is when I kind of found out, the basic details and nuances that had happened. So, like I said, it was a very sheltered life, especially by my mother. She, after she had passed away when I was 15, and afterward, her best friend told me that, your mother, every time you left the house, your mother followed you. And I was in shock. I figured, like, my mom could have been working for the CIA. She would have been a great agent for them because I never knew this was happening. But I understand it, having children of my own.
Yeah, Kay, you were 2 years old when this happened. So
Mhm.
obviously, you didn't understand what was going on, and I assume it was hard for your parents to explain what was going on without reliving the whole thing. And
Right.
so I'm just curious, so like growing up, did you observe their sadness, and what was it like for you to grow up knowing, and you would leave Bristol several years later, I think when you were 7 years old,
Mhm.
but knowing that people knew about it, and like how did they perceive you and the family from that point on?
Um, I did mainly from my father. I saw the sadness. Now, the day that she passed, there are, two things that I do remember. One being that meatloaf and baked potatoes were on the menu for dinner, and I remember asking my mom if Carol didn't come home, can I have her baked potato? And the other thing is when my mother first went driving and looking for Carol and saw her bike in front of the church, then went in, looked around, never thought of going up the choir loft. She went back home, told my father what she had seen, and he put us all in the car. And um, now that has been told to me, but what I remember is driving home in our car with the police officer driving and I would assume there was another officer following him. But my father's head just going from side to side, and a wail. I can't describe it, but I knew something was wrong, but I did make sure that, to the officer, that we lived in the house with the red door. But that is my most vivid memory of the whole thing at that age. Now, this was in October and I was 2. I would have been 3 in January, or I was 3 in January. So, I was closer to 3, but that is the biggest thing I remember, is just his head careening back and forth. And I mean,
Um, my God, this is first of all, it's so heart-wrenching to hear that. And so do you remember him putting the family in the car and driving to the church?
well, I mean, I'm assuming that's what happened because all 3 of us were there.
Hmm.
Um,
You were
you
at the
know,
church.
we're at the church. Yeah, my mother and I stayed in the car, and he came running out of the church and told my mother, just stay where you are. Do not get out of the car.
So
And
he
then
had
he,
he had found her when he had gone in, that
yeah,
your mother did not.
right, right.
Oh my God. So it is such a tragedy. I can't imagine parents processing it. Now, you were 2 years old. You were very young, and I'm sure you couldn't process what had happened. But I assume that you then had to process the fact that your sister was no longer there.
Hmm.
She was a big sister, and I don't know how much you remember about her, but the aftermath of it, of not having Carol Ann there anymore, what did that feel like to you?
That was, an empty feeling that she wasn't there. She she had like a 4-foot tall doll that, if you held its hand, it would walk. And she thought it would be fun to put it over the railing and have it walk down like the little pieces of steps, that were on the opposite side of the railing. And I was sitting in a chair under the banister there, and she basically dropped the doll on my head. That was one thing I remember. Another day I can remember, I had woken up from a nap, and my crib looked out over a window, and there were nuns leaving the house. And apparently, as you have reported, that none of the priests visited or comforted my family at all. And but the nuns would still stop in, but
We're talking to Kay Doherty Talanka, the younger sister of Carol Ann. So, do you remember her being a big sister to you?
in ways I do. And in ways I knew there was something missing. But to really put it in perspective, like you said, I was so young that it just didn't really. I knew something had changed, and I also know that my parents, after Carol's death, would have to come. I had then, after graduating to a big girl bed, I know they had to come in every night and make sure I was asleep, and then literally crawl out of the room. Otherwise, I would have terrible, terrible night terrors.
I mean, I just can't imagine what you had to go through and what your family had to go through. I'm listening to it now. I don't know how any of us could have processed this, but um, she was there one day and she wasn't there the next day. And I'm just curious. I know it was probably impossible for them to explain it to you, but you noticed that she wasn't there. And so I'm just curious, like, how did that all play out for you?
It just,
Overshadowed.
it kind of overshadowed everything, that, um, yeah,
Did
I
you lose
spoke
your happiness over it, Kay? Did you remember like being sad as you were growing up in your formative years?
maybe at times, yeah. I think, I was probably a more emotional and difficult child you know, than what they might have had she, had this not happened. But after the reports came out from JD, I spoke to my aunt, my father's sister, and she said, we never talked about it. She said, basically, we were all just thanking God that it wasn't one of our children. And,
So
in 1962, I mean, if you went to see, a doctor, a psychiatrist, whatever, about emotional support and things like it, you were one step in the loony bin. You know what I mean?
yeah.
That just wouldn't go away. And my parents dealt with it on their own. I think for a lot of reasons, people just didn't bring it up because they didn't want to remind them. But in 1962, there were no groups that, my parents had no one to talk to, really. They, just kept it within themselves, didn't hang their dirty laundry, so to speak. They, I don't
Usually
know.
you got comfort from you usually get comfort from the church, but in this particular situation, and we've talked about it before on the podcast, they didn't really administer any kind of comfort. You mentioned the
No,
nuns, but the father Sabatish, who was obviously a major suspect. Now your dad was a staunch Catholic, and you're telling me your mother was not. So
right. She
your
was
dad
raised
probably
Lutheran.
struggled with the idea that it could have been a priest. Do you remember how he handled that?
I do know that, you know, after this all happened, I I really can't give you a timeline except for possibly one Christmas when I was maybe 4 or 5. Um, I had gotten a little Tootie and Todd. They were Barbie's cousins. It was in a little ice cream stand, and I insisted I took that to church with me as a purse. So my father did actually go back to the church. And he would take me every week to mass. Um, I don't know how he did it. I
Okay, the same
honestly,
church, the same
yes,
church.
yes.
That,
I don't know how he did it.
Well,
I can't.
yeah.
The
It's faith.
man was
And Catholics back then, from my recollection, their faith was stoic and strong, and I think that was really kind of an impediment to the case because the Catholic Church was revered back then, and all the things that we have since learned did not exist. Um, your mother was not Catholic, and what adds to this tragedy for me is that you lost her at a young age as well. So you lost her 12 years later. Do you think that a broken heart contributed to her leaving this earth?
I do. I do. And it's only been recent years that I have had basically the wherewithal within myself to admit that I know my mother loved me deeply, but showing it was very difficult for her. Um, she was very, I wouldn't say cold, but she just wasn't, the normal touchy feely, huggy, kissy mother. And I do think that. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
But I do think a lot of that had to do with um, the fact that she knew what it was like to lose one and didn't want to get so close to another that, God
Yeah,
forbid it would ever happen again. Not in those circumstances, I'm sure, but, you know, you never know.
yeah, I mean that makes so much sense. Um, yeah, you were telling me that like your dad was a staunch Catholic, and that was one of the reasons why Carol Ann went to St. Mark's Elementary School.
Yes.
Now you come of age to go to elementary school, but they did not send you to St. Mark's School. Do you recall why?
That was one thing I know that my mother put her foot down. Um, I mean, if she respected my father's religious beliefs, she herself grew up as a Lutheran, um, and from what I understand, in the fifth grade class at St. Mark's, there was always an empty desk for my sister, which I thought was cruel. I think is cruel. I mean, when I learned about this and everything, I thought that it's just a constant reminder that um, that this child, was so tragically taken from us, and instead of having some closure, they just kept on and on.
Yeah, we've talked about that before in the podcast that they kept their desk open. And I got it, giving them any benefit of the doubt, they probably thought it was a tribute, but
I'm
it
sure.
was probably misguided. And the thing that also resonated with me was that the children were interrogated. Each one of them were pulled out of class and interrogated. The boys were had their belts confiscated. Now these are 9-year-old kids, and it just seems so sad that they had to go through that with this whole thing and constantly be reminded of Carol Ann not being in their class with that empty desk. So I totally agree with you when it came to that. Now, so you went to an elementary school. Do you remember anybody in the elementary school saying, "Oh, you're the from the family where the little girl was killed"?
No, I don't. I don't remember anyone saying that. Yeah, I had gone to James Buchanan, and again, I was only there for first grade and just I think until December of second, and that's when we moved upstate up to Berwick. But
Are you Yeah, so that was the Levittown School District. I assume it was the I don't know Woodrow Wilson School District at the time, whatever that school district was, which was just outside the Bristol limits. Because you guys were from Landreth Manor, which technically was
Mhm.
not in Bristol Borough, so you wouldn't have gone to Bristol Borough schools. But St. Mark's
Right.
obviously was the Catholic school that she went to. Um, so you left Bristol, and
Mhm.
yeah, I know there were business reasons with your dad, and your dad, his name was Frank Doherty, and he got involved in some kind of a printing business up there. But do you
Mhm.
think the move was influenced by just getting away from this?
I believe so. Yes, I believe it just came at an opportune moment, and the business that he purchased was in my mother's hometown. So yeah, I think that had a lot to do with it. Them thinking that, you know, not exposing me, you know, to once I got older and, to what had happened. And yeah, I'm sure that had a lot to do with it.
And you resided up there for your entire life.
Hmm.
Do you remember it helping your mother at all to be away from Bristol? Or was
I
she
don't,
just her heart was so heavy that it didn't really make that much of a difference?
she had her best friend from school to lean on. Now my parents were a bit older when I was born, so her best friend had grandchildren who were just a year or two younger than I was. And I remember one day that we were all, her two granddaughters and myself were talking, and something came up about my sister. And I remember the little granddaughter saying to me that, "Oh, yeah, your sister was shot." I was like, "Oh." I mean, I had no idea. And now, this little girl is telling me that my sister was shot, and that it just didn't quite make sense to me. I never really talked to my parents about it because I knew it was something they didn't want to talk about.
They never just sat down and said, "This is what had happened," and I
Yeah,
can totally understand that they didn't want to relive
no,
it.
no. I
So
actually found out from my cousin. I had a cousin on my mother's side that um, I was in ninth grade, and I said, "Steve, this is what I've heard. This is what I've." He said no, and he actually he was Carol's age. Um, I mean, he remembers being at the funeral, but he's the one who actually kind of filled me in on the story.
I can't imagine how sad the funeral was. I'm trying to. Uh, I talked to so many people about how this affected their lives, and I'm talking to somebody who's directly affected. And your daughter's in the room, and she lost what would have been an aunt. You lost a big sister, and so you don't even really know the details of it until 30 years later,
Mm-hmm.
when J.D. Mullane writes the story and the details of what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about reading about that and what your reaction was?
My greatest reaction to that whole series of articles was they had a picture of them bringing Carol's body out of the church, and it was at 9 o'clock that evening. And the first thing that hit me was she must have been so cold, and it was just tragic to me that she had to bear that. I know her spirit was not there, but that really got to me, that she was left there for that many hours. And I understand, the police investigation and gathering evidence and things like that, and thank God they did what they did. But that was probably the part that really, really hit home hard.
Okay. When I right after I turned 16, my father suddenly passed away. And
Right.
it was thank you. And it was heartbreaking. He was such a lovely guy. I think about him every day.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that my family did in the aftermath and since is we keep him very present. We talk about him a lot, celebrate his birthday. We always talk about him. We're always telling funny stories about
Mm-hmm.
him. And it keeps him here in a way.
Sure.
And I wonder, and I've been thinking about your family a lot, obviously. And I wonder, how did you navigate those waters? Was Carol Ann spoken about birthdays, or walk us through that, please?
No. No, she wasn't. I would notice, maybe my mom was quieter that day, or my dad had a couple extra Manhattans or beers that day, but no, really, the only thing I remember is when we moved to Berwick, we were on like a one-story home, like a ranch home. And my parents would have like an open house Christmas Eve. And I can remember my father just crying to his friend that, why isn't she here? Because her birthday was right there. I mean, she was named Carol after Christmas Carol. She was born on the 1st of December. And I never saw that emotion from my mother, but I did, I heard it in my room from my dad. And being 9, 10, 11 years old, I used to think, are they sad because it was her and not me? Would they rather, have her here than me? And, Christmas was pretty much a bust. But no, as far as celebrating anything, I don't know why.
Even
I mean,
the portrait, can I just,
yeah.
the portrait of her.
Yeah. Do you have? I was just going to ask you. Were there pictures that of her that were left around and looked at, or not?
Yeah, you'd be hard pressed to find a picture in our living room of me. They were all of Carol. There was, I believe you've shown the picture of her kind of sitting in a chair at my aunt's wedding. And my parents knew an artist who actually painted that into an oil painting, which I was telling Mike my daughter was telling Mike the other night, my father's house burned in 94, I'm sorry. And it was one of the things that survived was her
the portrait.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that and we talked about that. That's God coming in that particular situation. Do you have a photo you would like to show right now?
At the fire, just everything was destroyed.
Okay.
And
Okay.
My daughter Carol, she has the portrait. She doesn't hang it, but she has it.
Mhm. And we're talking to Kay Doherty Tonka, the younger sister of Carol Ann Doherty, who this podcast has been all about. Um, and you actually were involved, at that point in '92 when this case was brought back up, investigators, just like this podcast, I think, has initiated some action that way, and I think it's heading in a positive way to identify who the killer was of this. But back then, law enforcement obviously got involved, and then there was a grand jury, and you found out who the suspects were at the time, and you remember being brought to the grand jury. You did not testify, but your dad did as well. So now, when all that is out there, and you're looking at the suspects, what are you doing? Are you trying to solve the case? I'm just curious that what kind of reaction you would have to that.
It's funny because I can remember watching Unsolved Mysteries. And this was a few years before JD even got in touch with us, that I was thinking of presenting the case to that television show to see if they could help at all. And you hem and haw about things like this, and all of a sudden JD calls my father. And I think, well, this is a much better route to go because it's local, rather than I did find it odd with the fact that basically Father Sabatish's mother, where he grew up kind of halfway between here and Bristol. William Schrader, he was in the Wilkes-Barre area, which is only 20 miles from me now. And it just I mean, nothing seemed to go to Pittsburgh or Erie. It was all here in the Northeast or down there. I My parents had a friend who was a captain in the state police, and he remembered the case. Whether or not I'm not sure if he worked on it, but he actually remembered, especially with the similarities with Marie Chivarella.
Yeah, that was
And
the young lady, Hazelton, who was
right.
killed in a similar fashion, and that case wound up being solved. And we'll talk about that in a future episode because that also had a really interesting little twist to it with a connection to Bristol in some weird form of a basketball game.
Mhm.
But I've shared this with you because the police chief at the time in Bristol, and I know you spoke to him, was Vincent Faragalli. He was my uncle, and my example of so many lives being affected by this, his life was definitely affected by it. He also would not talk about it. He kept the photo of Carol Ann handy for him on his bureau to remind him. And
Mhm.
it got me angry in 1992 when it seemed to be a wrestling match between law enforcement agencies that turned the case cold again. Do you remember anything about that? Because the grand jury investigation went nowhere.
I was told by um, an assistant DA and the DA actually that this case had never closed. Of course, no unsolved murders ever closed, but they said that, even in retirement, the county detectives that were involved still followed leads, followed, you know, calls that they would get that, hey, I think this happened on that day. And basically the articles, from what I understood, um, William Schrader's sister still lived in the area of the church, and she warned him that that these articles had come out, and to just be prepared, I guess is what. And yeah, I don't know why they couldn't work together. That does
Well,
bother me.
as the story goes, told me by the Bristol police chief of 1992, they had been ready to call in this sophisticated forensic group called the VDOC Society, who had
Hmm.
solved many other crimes, including the boy in the box crime. And
Hmm.
the Bristol police were certain that the VDOC Society would really put their efforts into solving this because the VDOC Society told them that this case is solvable and here's how we can do it. And
Hmm.
they had access to forensics and forensic people. And then the DA's office kind of snatched the case away because and one of the things I learned about this, Kay, is that law enforcement agencies really want the credit, and sometimes they don't work together. So hopefully now we have gotten to a point where they can work together to finally solve this.
I certainly hope so. I really do.
You-
I feel like, I felt like you said that it was a matter of, oh, we're going to solve it. We're going to solve it. How about us? How
Yeah,
about my family?
yeah,
You
and
know,
that's
don't think
really
of
the point.
yourselves.
Yeah, that is the quintessential point of this whole thing. That the family needs to have the closure first
Right.
before law enforcement can take credit for some
Hmm.
kind of closure. And the fact that this case has been cold for so long, um, and again with the grand jury thing and nothing coming out of it, um, what your dad was called, what do you remember about that? What do you remember about? Was he frustrated that it didn't go anywhere again? Were you frustrated? Were you starting to form your own opinions as to who did this?
My father, unbeknownst to me, had a friend that brought him the series of articles, and he called me after he had read them. And I kind of felt that I should have been there with him, but it didn't work out that way. But then days to come, I would, he would call me, or I would go over and he would say, "Oh, I have a grocery list. Can you go get me these things?" I'm like, "Well, Daddy, why aren't you coming with me?" He said, "Well, what if there's a phone call?"
So he was
He
never
thought within
vigilant
a
that,
week of,
yeah.
these articles coming out, he felt in his heart that it was going to be solved. And I went out and I bought him an answering machine so he would leave the house. And
Did he have an idea? Did he or you
my father, I don't know if he really, I think in his heart that he always suspected it was Father Sabatish. Then we went down to the grand jury, and that's when they brought William Schrader to light. And I think that just because to talk to the retired detectives and the DA, that's who it is. They had no other suspect in mind. I mean,
They thought it was
that was
Schrader.
him, and no uncertain terms.
Did you see Father Sabatish or Schrader in the grand jury process when you were there? You didn't get called, but you were there. Did you
No, I
see that?
didn't.
Okay.
The only reason I actually was, I mean, I had no idea that I was going to be sworn in to the grand jury, but they, meaning the DA's office, felt that it would be beneficial to them if I was sworn into the grand jury, not as someone who was testifying, but as someone who then could not speak to the press and, have any more contact with JD.
Vince, do you have you had a question for Kay, I think.
Yeah, as Mike, to dovetail on both what you both have just been talking about, I was thinking about, with the competing forces that want to have put the stake in the ground and say, yeah, we did it, we solved it, and then also knowing how resistant the Catholic Church was in all of this and not helpful. Do you harbor resentment towards any of these entities?
I feel that the Catholic Church definitely put its nose where it didn't belong. I believe that they played on Chief Farragalley's sense of religion. You know, Vince, we know you're a good Catholic. You don't want to do this to the church. They were so worried about having the church, I believe, reconsecrated is what they, I don't know, had to have it blessed again or something before they could have mass. And, all these things were trivial in my mind. They didn't matter. Let's have a heart here. My mother-in-law has had so many stories when she and my father-in-law divorced, of the priest in Berwick coming to her house to sit with her, just listen to her if she needed anything. And I just thought, my poor parents, they really had no one. And I'm sure that, friends of theirs, that there were times when maybe things came up that I was not aware of. But it just seemed to me that they were alone in this whole thing. And yeah, I do blame the Catholic Church for that.
And on that note, Kay, one of the most upsetting things that I have heard that kind of shakes me to the core is that your dad was so heartbroken and so yearning for some kind of solace, and tried to get it through his faith. And you told me the story that we've talked about earlier on this podcast about him going into a confessional with Father Sabatish. And I believe asking him something like, is it a sin for me to think that this could have been done by a priest? Knowing he was talking to the priest who was the suspect in it. And did your dad share this with you that Father Sabatish walked out of the confessional?
I learned about that through the articles with
Okay.
JD. Yeah.
But your dad never
And
spoke of that.
no. And I was shocked. I mean, I I can't believe that someone who valued their faith so much didn't have the decency, to, if he was innocent, offer comfort or, but I believe that Father Sabatish also had, his own demons to deal with. He was put on I believe um, in Philadelphia, the bad priest list.
Yeah. In 2004, the
I mean, it was
indictment of the
posthumously, but
the archdiocese, where so many predator priests were named, and his track record was just heinous. So I listen, this has been very emotional for you. I just have two more questions for you.
sure.
And I so appreciate you sharing the story with. I think that people that are going to watch this podcast are going to feel so involved with this and your pain and everybody else's pain. And I'm so glad you did this for us. You told me that at the end of the day, you thought your dad knew who did this. Now, are we talking about he has passed, he has since passed? Are you talking about that in the afterlife he now is content knowing who did it, or do you think that he knew before he passed?
No, 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 no. I just
It was, if I can, Mike, I'll just speak to this if I can. When my
Yes,
papa
this is
passed,
Jen,
Please.
Kay's daughter Jen, who is in the room as well.
hello. I will say that when my papa passed, and he was in a nursing facility, and my mom went into his room with a nurse, opened a window, and when she came out to me and my father and my sister, the first thing she said to us through tears was, now he knows what happened to Carol. He knows who did it. That was the very first, like, so it was heavy and present forever, right? And there
Yeah.
was, and that was the reaction, right? Like, not he lived a good life, not I'm feeling very sad. Not the very first statement that she made was, he's
He
with
knows
Carol
now.
and he knows who did it.
He's with Carol. He knows.
Yeah.
Now, you guys also had told me about, and I shared this story with you, that a teacher at St. Mark's had pulled me aside when we were doing this CBS piece and said that she and a couple of other teachers have witnessed through the hallways of St. Mark's a little blonde haired girl who was Carol Ann walking through. You also said that you had that kind of a sighting.
mhm. The first time it happened, I was at my father's home with my daughter Carol, and my father had a utility room where the furnace and things were. Um, and Carol just kind of stopped talking. My Carol kind of just stopped talking in the middle of everything, and I'm like, "What's the matter?" Just, Mom, we have to go. We have to go. And I said, "What?" We left, and I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "In the window of the utility room, there was a little blonde girl, and she was looking right at me." Then after I had mentioned that my father's house had burned, and there
That night.
that night, I had talked to my father's doctor, and just because my father was getting older, had some health issues, he put him in the hospital for observation. The stress of the fire and knowing that, he had lost basically everything. Um, So like I said, we had his dog. We had, had some things that we had salvaged, and I
At our
opened,
house.
yeah, at our house, and I opened the door, and there was a little blonde girl coming up my driveway that
Like floating. Like
float.
it was
Yes,
like
it was like not a mist. It was denser than a mist, but an apparition, I guess. And I mean, it just seemed as though she lost her home, so to speak, because I mean, I'm a firm believer in the afterlife, but I'm sure that because of the trauma and the the knowing of how it affected my parents, I'm sure if there were any way, she would be here comforting.
Kay, one of the things that we've really tried hard to do throughout this podcast is to show great restraint and respect for Carol and your family. And the she's not merely a character or a series of evidentiary points.
Mhm.
She was a little girl. She was your sister. And I don't want people to forget that. And maybe to help our audience to get closer to this, is there something that you can say about her as that maybe that even posthumously, like something that kind of illustrates how that she was this sweet little girl and not just a character in this horrible
Mhm.
tale?
Yeah,
Like, can you characterize her?
from what everything everyone's told me, she
Yeah.
was a very happy-go-lucky child. I know my parents did say that she was struggling with reading when she first went into school, and she had a second grade teacher that my parents just praised. I could not tell you who it was. I'm very thankful, but this teacher instilled in her such a love of reading that that's I mean, that was her passion. She loved to read. She loved all kinds of the Nancy Drew mysteries, and I know I had some of her Bobbsey twins books. I mean, she just was a voracious reader after this teacher, and I know my parents were so thankful to this woman that you know taught her the joys of reading. Yeah, but
This
yeah,
is
I've never
yeah.
heard anything like, oh, she was a little brat, or nothing like that. She was always had a smile on her face, was so proud of the English racer bicycle that she had. um that was like her pride and joy, that Santa had brought her. And just
Right.
I really wish I would have known her. Could
Did your
use her
parents?
all times.
Yeah. Did your parents keep the bicycle? Do you remember what had happened to
Yes,
that bicycle? It
yes,
was
I had
so
it. I
you
rode it.
have it? You rode it.
I did rode it. I did ride it. Yes. I mean, eventually, the
Yeah.
elements got to it, but
Yeah. All right, this is my last question. Uh, my major goal through this whole thing was to, I don't know, I don't know if justice is the right word, but I just have wanted to identify the sociopath who committed this crime because I want their family to know that that the part of their family could do something as horrible as this and impact so many other lives. But at the end of the day, you've lost a sister. Jen has lost somebody who could have been a really cool aunt. So I'm just curious to know the closure on this case. What would it do for you? And I think there's going to be closure. I think this DNA is going to come through. We're going to identify the killer. But what would it do for you to find the killer? Because you still have a hole in your heart.
it it would be amazing. I don't even projecting how I might feel. It's I was so set that after my father had passed, and as Jen said, I went in the room, I opened the window so his spirit could fly, and I knew he knew. And I thought that was enough closure for me. And then they solved the Chivarella murder. And I just thought, even though the parents were deceased, as mine were, the the part of knowing must have been such a relief on the remaining children. I had spoken to Mrs. Chivarella years ago, but never any of the other children. But I can only imagine how they'd feel, and that's when I thought, maybe this isn't enough. Maybe I really do need some closure. And I mean, for what you have done with these podcasts and getting things going, I cannot thank you enough. You and Vince have been so gracious, so kind, and I'm so appreciative. I mean, even my daughters, I mean, I don't talk about it a lot, which I probably should, and let them know just how their lives could have been, with, like you said, the cool aunt. But without having the closure, it's very hard to
Yeah.
speak about it.
Obviously, it wouldn't bring her back, but there
Yeah.
is some kind of a soul filling benefit to knowing once and for all that somebody didn't get away with this.
Right.
Kay,
Right.
listen, you have been amazing, and I am so touched by the fact that that you shared this and had the courage to share it. I know people are going to feel the same way when they see this. You have a great spirit. This was not easy to talk about. It was very sad to go through these things. And talking to you the other day, I know you have a wonderful spirit, and so does your daughter. And I wish you and your family nothing but the best. I hope we stay in touch. And I hope the next time we're in touch, we have news that they have found who did
Champagne.
this, because I am not going to stop until they do.
Thank you so much. And to JD Mullane the other day said to me, who, I kind of, give him credit for getting the ball rolling, for actually, because he walked into the church and he told me, you mentioned her name today, and it's still, everybody knows who she is. But JD said, I'm getting to be retirement age. And he said, I can say I've had a wonderful job. It's been wonderful. Excuse me. But if this is solved, then I can say I've had a wonderful career. And
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I know JD has been a very important part of this process. And I feel like that he's almost a brother in this process with me. So I'm glad that you said that. And again, we're going to stay in touch. And I thank you
I
so
hope so,
much.
Mike. I really
For
do.
Vince, I'm Mike. There's been Kay Doherty Tlanka, the younger sister of Carol Ann Doherty, and her daughter Jen. Thank you guys for spending some time with us, and Godspeed.